So if you're looking for a really easy way to manage your websites locally, in this video we're going to take a look at something called Laravel Homestead. Now Laravel Homestead is basically a Vagrant box with its configuration file that allows you to map different folders to websites like laratest.app, which we'll be installing. This will be a Laravel application, or project.app, which is going to be like a personal project. So you don't have to use this with Laravel. It's entirely up to you. But I like to use it because it's just so simple to set up. It's so simple to get going with. So if you're not sure what virtual machines are, what virtual box is, or what Vagrant is, we'll take a quick look at what these are. You might already know what this is, so feel free to just skip ahead a little bit. So we're going to be installing something called VirtualBox, and this allows you to run virtual machines on your computer. So whatever operating system you're working on, perhaps you might be on Windows, you might be on OS X, you might even be on Linux, you can simulate an environment that allows you to easily manage a server-like environment, so probably close to what you would do when you put it into hosting. Vagrant is basically a way to manage virtual boxes easily, so you sort of get rid of that layer of complication with it, and this is really easy to use. And couple this with Laravel Homestead, this allows you to really easily set up these type of environments, even more easily than you would with Vagrant. So like I said, we're going to have environments like this, so you can have multiple projects on your machine all running on a specific environment. And you might be wondering, well, what's the point of this? Can't I just use MAMP or WAMP or XAMPP or whatever you use? Well, you could, but if you've ever tried to, say, update, install like an encrypt extension with PHP, or you've come across problems, then this can get really tricky, and it does get really annoying to work with. And with this, what you can actually do is you can SSH into your server, and you can update anything you want like you would normally on hosting. And even if you don't use hosting, you can learn how to use the command line to troubleshoot, install things that you need, check out log files. It's a lot easier to manage. So if you've never worked with this before and it's really complicated, watch the video through and see how this can probably change the way you work locally. It does make a massive difference once you get going with it. It's like anything really. You sort of struggle to understand something, but then eventually you can't live without it. So I'm going to be following through the guide, just so you know that the guide is here. We're going to be taking the commands from this guide, but along the way I will explain exactly what we're doing and why we're doing it. So I'm not just going to be copying and pasting commands. So this works on Windows, so VirtualBox works on Windows, Vagrant works on Windows. You're also going to need Composer, which you can get for Windows as well. And this is a dependency manager for PHP. I'm just going to be using this to install Laravel using the create project command. You don't have to do this, you can do this without Laravel, but if you want to follow along, go ahead and get Composer. I'd highly recommend using it day to day in your development anyway. So once you've installed VirtualBox, Vagrant, and Composer, we can get going. As long as they're installed, they're really easy to install, we can get started. So basically, Homestead contains a box that contains all of this software, which is perfect for pretty much any development project, specifically PHP. And it's obviously perfect for Laravel as well. So it includes Ubuntu, so you've got that operating system on there. It obviously includes PHP, HHVM as well. Nginx is the web server. You've got MySQL for database, and it includes things like Node, Redis, Memcache, so anything you might need to build a really cool application. So inside of my command prompt then, I currently have a directory called www, just www. And this is just sat within my home directory on my machine. This is where I'm going to create folders to contain all of my projects. So I'm going to have, say, well, it could be any amount of projects. Now what we're going to do in here is we're going to create two projects. One's going to be called Laratest, which is just going to be a basic Laravel installation. And the second one is going to be called Project, which is just going to contain one PHP file. This can be a sort of project away from Laravel, so I'm going to demonstrate how we add multiple sites here too. Okay, so let's get started. Enough talking. So we're going to install we're going to pull down with Composer a blank Laravel installation. So we use the Composer command. Make sure you've got Composer installed. Just run Composer on the command line. So we're going to say Composer. We're going to create a project, and this is Laravel/Laravel. So we're pulling this Laravel project down, and we want to put this inside a specific directory. So I'm going to call this Laratest, and I'm going to say prefer distribution. So this is going to take maybe quite a long time to do if you've never downloaded this before. If you have downloaded it before, it will obviously come from the cache, but let's just wait a few moments for this to finish. Okay, so that's now done. Let's take a look inside of my text editor. I've got this dub folder open, which is the one I just went into a moment ago, and you can see that now I have a Laravel installation here. Cool. So we're not going to be running this locally. We're not going to be firing up MAMP or anything like that to actually run this. We're going to be creating our environment that will sync the files between our local and that virtual machine. And if that doesn't make too much sense, it will become clear in a moment. Okay, so what we now need to do then is inside of the terminal, we need to go ahead and download Laravel Homestead box, and we then need to pull down the repository which contains the Vagrant file, which we'll go over as well. So I'm currently in this dub directory. But what I want to do is create a separate directory in here, we'll do this in a moment, that will allow us to boot up our virtual machine, pull all of our projects in and have them available on the domains that we saw up here. So let's scroll down inside of the documentation. This is really useful. We need to add our Vagrant box. So Vagrant is the command we need. Obviously make sure you've got Vagrant installed by just running Vagrant like that, and you'll get a list of commands up. So Vagrant box add, and this is the box name. So this is all we need to do here. So let's go ahead and paste this in. You can do this from any directory. It doesn't matter because it globally adds it to Vagrant. So obviously for me, this already exists. So for you, this would take a little bit of time to download. It's a fairly big file size. So just go away, grab a coffee or something and come back when it's done. So now what we want to do is go ahead and clone the Homestead repository, and this contains our Vagrant file and everything we need. So all we're doing here is using Git to download this. If you don't have Git installed on your machine, go ahead and install that now. So this is the name of the repository here, and we're putting that into a Homestead directory. Now it's important that this goes in a directory outside of all of your other projects. So you wouldn't, for example, cd into Laratest and get this. You would do it within the directory that contains all your projects. So let's go ahead and clone that down. That won't take a moment. Okay, so that's done. So now we have this Homestead directory. So let's go ahead and see what this contains. We'll do this in the text editor just for simplicity. So inside of Homestead, we've got a Vagrant file, and this is the file that basically sets everything up and does everything it needs to do. You shouldn't really need to touch this unless you need to do anything specific, and we won't be going into this. But we've got this YAML file here that allows us to easily configure the folders that we want to sync with Vagrant and the sites that we want to be available. So at the moment, these are pretty standard, and it's just sort of picking up this code directory within our home directory and plonking it here within our virtual box. But we're going to need to modify this. As well, you are going to need to generate a key that you're going to use. You're going to need a public key and a private key. Now, Laravel's documentation on this does tell you how to generate a key using a command line here on some kind of Linux-based system. But on Windows, it does give you some brief instructions. If you don't know how to generate an SSH key, go ahead and use something like PuTTY if you're on Windows, and then go ahead and make sure you know the directory to your public and private key. And I think PuTTY gives you the option to save these in a specific location, so you can do that. Otherwise, this command here, replacing in your email address, will go ahead and it will generate a key in the .ssh directory, and that's id rsa.pub and id rsa. So we're not going to touch these. I already have a public and private key generated, but go ahead and do that, and then you can follow along with the rest of the video. So the folders that we need to map. Now, this dub directory here is included within my home directory. So this is home directory. So I'm just going to say, well, I want to map home dub, and I want to map that to home vagrant and then a specific folder, or it could be home vagrant dub. It really doesn't matter where you map it to, as long as you know this location, because when we SSH into our box later, we're going to need to know where this location is. Okay, so that's the part where we actually map our folder full of our different projects. So this will map Lara test and all of its files to this directory here. So it will be available at /Lara test. But the sites really is the cool part about this, because it allows us to map a specific domain here to that specific project. So, for example, if we wanted to say start up a new Laravel project called Lara test, we've already got our files. We're going to say Lara test and we're going to call it laratest.app. This can be called whatever you want, laratest.dev, whatever you want, but I'm going to call it laratest.app. So here, let's map this, or let's look at the folder structure here. So we've got home, vagrant, dub. Let's get rid of all of this. This is just an example piece. We're going to map this to home, vagrant, dub / Lara test, because that's our directory here, and we end up with our public directory, because that's where we sort of kick off looking at our Laravel application. You can also do things like set in sort of environmental variables, but we're not really going to look at that. At least you know they're there. So I've saved this file out. Now what I want to do is go ahead and run Vagrant. So let's clear this and look at where we are. We're currently within our dub directory, but we need to cd into our Homestead directory to do this. So we've got in here all of our stuff, but now all we need to do is run Vagrant up, and this will boot your virtual machines. Okay, so once that's all finished, you do get a lot of output here, but I'm going to explain what some of this output means. If we scroll up a little bit, you can see here that we've got this forwarding port section. And all this means is it's forwarding the ports on the virtual machine to these ports on your local machine. So for example, if we want to access our application's web server, which I'd assume you would want to, we've got this port 80 here mapped to port 8000. So rather than when we come to look at laratest.app, we would use the port 8000. I've already got this set up here. So that's basically that. We've got the same for MySQL, and for example, SSH is mapped to 4 twos, and then MySQL is mapped with just a 0 on the end. So now that we've got that, what do we do from here? Well, in this case, let's go ahead and actually look at laratest.app 8000. So let's give this a refresh, and it's still not working. So why is this not working? We've mapped laratest.app. We know that the port 80 is forwarded to port 8000, but it's still not working. The problem here is that we need to edit our hosts file, because at the moment, the DNS service is going to fail for a lookup on laratest.app. So all we need to do is go ahead and open our hosts. Now on Windows, this is going to be different. So you're going to need to go ahead and look up how you edit your hosts file on a Windows machine, and then go ahead and follow the instructions. The file structure within this will look very similar. So I'm going to sudo over, I'm going to use vim to edit my hosts file here, and this is the list of hosts that we map. So in this case, I've already got a couple set up, but we need to add a new entry here. So I'm going to map 127.0.0.1 to laratest.app, like we gave when we set up our homestead.yaml file. So I'm going to go ahead and save this. And now when I head over to my browser and refresh, we get the Laravel installation. So now we're able to access this. We're able to edit our files, and this will be reflected. At the moment, this is pointing to our virtual machine. So another question you might have is, how do changes in here map to what's being copied over to our virtual machine? These files here are actually stored on our virtual machine, but what happens is Vagrant will sync these up. So for example, if we were to go over to our roots file, and I was to get rid of the default here and just return something like hello, then we get the changes. So that's really quickly synced them changes from our local files to our virtual machine. So you can just go ahead and inside of your editor, edit to your heart's content, and then preview this on your virtual machine. But we might want a little bit more control on our virtual machine. We might want to go ahead and install a new service. We might want to go ahead and look at error logs, or we might want to modify something on here. So how do we do this? Well, there's a couple of ways. You can either use Vagrant's SSH command, or you can go ahead and load up your favorite SSH client, and you can go into port 2222. Now in this case, I'm just going to be using Vagrant SSH because from the command line for me, it's a lot easier. But obviously if you're using something like Windows, it's going to be a lot easier to go ahead and use another client. So now we're actually inside our virtual box. You can see here that we're running Ubuntu. As we explained earlier, Homestead runs Ubuntu. Let's go ahead and do a directory listing. You can see now we've got that www directory that we're mapping from our local files. So let's go into this and take a look. And there we go. So we've got our Laratest directory there. So let's go ahead and say Laratest. And there we go. We've got all our files. So from here, you can do things like composer update. You can go ahead and run artisan, maybe siege your database, or go ahead and do whatever you need to do, migrations, whatever. So this is the control that you get from your virtual machine. You can SSH into it and do whatever you want. And I'll leave that up to you because it entirely varies what you might want to do. So let's go ahead and exit out of SSH here. And now we're going to look at multiple sites. I want to create an entirely new project, but I want to also have this running through a virtual box. And I want this to be called project.app. So this is fairly straightforward. All we need to really do is create a new directory inside of our www directory. So let's go ahead and go back here, and I'm going to make a directory called project, and I'm going to go into that directory, and I'm going to create an index.php file. So we now have this project folder with index.php. And here, let's just go ahead and echo out project. Okay, so at the moment then, this isn't going to automatically map. It's not automatically going to say, oh, I found a new folder called project, let me map this to a new site. We need to specifically tell Homestead that this exists now. So again, we go ahead and open up our homestead.yaml file, and under sites, we can now add a new entry. So we just copy basically exactly what's been written here. We choose a new domain for this, and we go ahead and we map it to a specific folder. In this case, it's going to be pretty much similar to this, so I'll just copy and paste this down here. But this time it's going to be www/project, www/project, and that's all we need to do. We obviously need to update our hosts file again because project.app is not included in there. So let's go ahead and do that now. So we're going to go ahead and open up our hosts file again. We're going to go down. We're going to add a new entry here. So 127.0.0.1, and this is project.app. Save that out. Go over to project.app, and it doesn't look quite right. You'll notice that now we're getting the same result here. Now the reason for this is we haven't provisioned Vagrant to take into account these new changes. So let's go back over to our Homestead directory, and let's clear this out. And we're going to go ahead and we're going to use the Vagrant provision command. So Vagrant provision. And what this does, it will take into account your new settings and do its thing, restart Nginx. And now when we go over to project, we now get project. So make sure you go ahead and provision for every new change you make. So now what I can do is I can edit both of these projects. They'll automatically be synced to my Vagrant environment. If I want to go ahead and do anything on my machine to change what install things, I can go ahead and Vagrant SSH into that machine. Now, as we mentioned earlier, there are other services you can access via Homestead. If we just scroll down in the documentation here, there's a few other bits and pieces that are quite useful, but we've got this daily usage section. We know how to connect to via SSH. We know that the port 22 is mapped to 2222, but connecting to your databases is probably a really good place to look at because it's important. So we know that these ports 3306 is mapped to 33060, and the same for Postgres as well. But we will at some point need to access these. So how do we go about doing this? It's all in the documentation, but I'll quickly show you how I might connect to my database from here. So inside of my MySQL GUI, I'm going to go ahead and create a new favorite, and I'm going to call this laratest.app. And I'm going to go ahead and connect to 127.0.0.1. The username here, if we just check the documentation, is Homestead. The password is secret. So let's go ahead and say Homestead secret. The port is 3306, but with a 0 on the end. Remember, that's been mapped. So let's go ahead and test this connection, and connection succeeded. So let's save the changes here and connect. And then going over to choose a database, we've got this Homestead database just here, which will show us all of our different tables. So that's pretty much it. We've looked at a really basic example of setting up a couple of projects within Laravel Homestead. Really easy to get started with. There is a lot more that you can do here, specifically a lot more that you can do with Vagrant. But if you really want to get started up with virtual machines and make your life a lot easier, then go ahead and check out Laravel Homestead with Vagrant.